Hello everyone and welcome to the Topical Hour. God of War Ragnarök Valhalla was one of the most delightful surprises of the holiday season, and even though the marketing for it was a little bit sketchy, seeing as it was announced like 2 weeks before release at the Game Awards and the trailer was pretty much just a compilation I think just about anyone could have made, it's really good. I think the marketing was sketchy because there was a tiny budget for it as the DLC was free and there's not really a ton to reveal, so they had to save what they could for word of mouth, which worked pretty well. That said, it's probably the best DLC I've played since ever. And there's a ton of reasons for that. First and foremost is the story. The people who made it labeled it as an epilogue for Kratos, but honestly, it was a lot more like a conclusion for me. I remember a lot of rumors about Ragnarok's DLC being Atreus focused, and as much as I didn't mind that, I still felt like there was more to say about Kratos. I honestly felt that Ragnarok's story was a bit lacking, because when you remove the Atreus sections, the amount of story that squarely focuses on the God of War is strikingly little. Even the final fight with Odin was more for Atreus, as Kratos had only spoken to Odin 2 times before the finale. So, needless to say, it wasn't that Kratos was mishandled, he just didn't really get enough time to shine, especially with both the dwarves, Freya, and Atreus needing their own moments to shine. Here we have the same amount of characters, but no Ragnarok in the background. Between Mimir, Kratos, Tyr, Sigrun, and Freya, it's much better, because pretty much all of them serve Kratos' story as much as they serve their own. As for the actual plot of being invited to Valhalla, it's cool. Probably the biggest issue I had with Ragnarok was the Tyr reveal being Odin. Now all of that is resolved because we finally get the Tyr we deserve, complete with several varied boss battles, several visual design upgrades, and several stories to tell as Kratos ascends through Valhalla across several attempts. Finally, we get the warrior spoken of in the 2018 game, and the sage promised in the giant's prophecies. This is your reminder to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. And finally, we get to re-explore Kratos' Greek past. For instance, we really didn't have a great idea on how the reimagined camera and gameplay system actually factored into the canon, and now we know it doesn't. The old games versus the new ones are just different perspectives on different times in the exact same sequence of events. And giving us the classic appearance makes it more clear just how much time has gone past as well. Not only is Kratos' skin much less ashen, but his tattoos are also a lot more faded than I previously considered, which implies to me hundreds if not thousands of years since his previous temptations to murder. Before I kinda thought it was just the new game's art design that had him fit in more with the environment, but now the differences are a lot more apparent. Tyr also implies a little bit that the people of Greece may still be there. Obviously Tyr's been effectively dead for at least 100 years, and he heard stories about Kratos after he left Greece, so that could imply that Greece, even if only barely or possibly not at all, is still standing to some extent, even if ravaged by the environment. But aside from Kratos and Tyr, there's Mimir and the Shield Maidens. I really like the relationship that Kratos and Mimir have built, and having it culminate in this DLC. And I also like how expanded Sigrun and Mimir's relationship is too. It's impressive because it was kind of a throwaway plotline in 2018, but it's a big chunk of Valhalla's dealings. Another thing that was disappointing to me in the main game, which is probably the most subjective opinion I have on it, was the lack of stories from Mimir. Granted, there are stories that Freya tells, and Kratos tells, and Atreus tells, but Mimir's actual stories are surprisingly little, and there's something about his that are much different from the others. Maybe it's just me, but after the last game, I would have assumed like double the stories in this game, and it was something that I looked forward to as a feature. And Valhalla kinda delivers on that. Not necessarily in the volume of stories, but the amount of tightly written dialogue that feels pointed and packed to the brim with alternate perspectives and meetings and ponderings. You can hang on to everything both Mimir and Kratos speak to each other, and it feels extremely well written. And this DLC made me actually care about Sigrun more than I thought I would, so that's a plus. But now, for the gameplay. Obviously there's a lot to be said about some of this gameplay. It's simply extremely well done, and if you believe otherwise, let me convince. First and foremost, it was bold right off the bat to just give you all the skills that Kratos has in the base game, and to make armor completely aesthetic. But I like it. It takes the onus off of XP gain, and now you can use whatever armor set you want so long as you earn it, without having to level it up completely for transmog. Then there's the ritual of selection. I like the idea of encouraging you to vary your gameplay not by force, but by offering you extra rewards by doing things differently every single time. The permanent upgrades are good because it'll take you a while to get them, but each time you die you feel more accomplished because you're still unlocking a substantial amount of upgrades. It's very well balanced in that. In fact, I found myself sometimes grateful when I died at times because it gave me an opportunity to use more resources for more upgrades. And then there's the completely new stuff. Enemies, weaponry, bosses, and glyphs. Now, while I know a lot of glyphs were taken from the game, I'm actually pretty satisfied with how powerful you feel when you get the max amount of glyphs. Plus, there are clearly some new ones thrown in the mix that wouldn't have worked in the base game anyway. As for the mini-bosses, I really like them. With Valhalla's chosen on the max difficulty, I'd typically die at least one time. And like I said, I didn't get super frustrated because it gave me an opportunity to hone my skills. I forget every once in a while that Magni and Modi are also in the DLC. I register that it probably didn't take a ton of effort to put these two in the game, but it's a really easy way to add variation and give more godly fights, which are the best fights in these games anyway. And again, as a surprise, it's a nice one. Obviously the sanctuaries look very good. Some have said that they're just a bunch of reused assets, but that's not how it works. And even if they were somehow, they've still been turned into beautiful and surreal interpretations of places we've already seen. And it's nice to not know the exact layout of where I am as someone who knows the base game map pretty well. And besides, there are a ton of completely new areas in the game. The upper tiers of Valhalla are obviously inspired by both Greece and by Evaldi's workshop, which I like. It's a nice way to acknowledge that Niflheim used to be very different from the perspective of Kratos without just putting Niflheim in twice. And obviously having it be Greek themed makes it a stark contrast from the lower levels of Valhalla. So the moment you get tired of the sanctuaries, you get a bunch of Greek locales, including the Aegean boat in the desert area, which again is fantastic. It's a nice way to add even more challenge and a bit of fan service, admittedly, to this DLC. Speaking of fan service, there's also Helios and the Blade of Olympus. Both are cool in their own way. I like Helios because it's a way to actively antagonize Kratos for his actions, and again, fan service. But then there's the Blade of Olympus. It's actually genius to not only make it a rage path, not only to make it extremely quick to activate, but to give it to you for outside of the DLC too. It's so impressive and lovely, and again, fan service. But to put so much effort into so-called fan service. The point is not to give the fans what they want, but to simultaneously serve the narrative, and that's what this DLC excels at the most. But after that, obviously, is the real godly fights. With Tyr. I brushed on it earlier, but wow, Tyr's boss fights are incredibly done. The novelty of them being there at all is already incredible, but then the fights themselves are good. Now obviously, if you pay close attention, there are a couple of reused moves from common enemies, but again, I don't really mind at all, because you never face this combination of moves from any enemy in the game. And probably my favorite detail is just how hard Tyr hits your shield. Like, Kratos has to brace for these hits, which again, Tyr and Kratos are equals in a lot of ways, and narratively it would take very little for Tyr to take Kratos' place as the strongest of the two. And they are a great challenge too. Not even that the fights are all that difficult, but that you are genuinely afraid to lose against this guy, because that's a guaranteed 20 to 30 minutes before you make it to this point again. He spends a lot of the fights giving great advice to Kratos as they fight as well, fully letting him know that his past is a lot more complicated than he acknowledges, which is nice. And then you beat him 1, 2, 3, 4 times, each time with different weapons and mechanics. Each time more fun than the last. Each time feeling about as difficult as the fights with Thor and Odin in the endgame, if not more so. And then Kratos opens the door. Finally, we see the truth of what Kratos, the mighty god of war, is terrified of. It's not his past self. It's what he would become if he lost everything represented by his past self. Kratos' monologue is an absolutely beautiful performance from Chris Judge that I'm sad wasn't included in the Game Awards, because I feel like this entire DLC was his best performance in the series for the most part. And this monologue is everything. He talks about how cruel his younger self is, but slowly accepts that his younger self is not someone or something else. It's just him at an earlier point in his very long life. And he does realize that, or rather accept it finally. It is a part of his past, but that he is still more than that, and has always been more than what people saw. His past self is a part of him, but the new Kratos is not a part of his past self. He has changed. And so with this, Kratos decides that he can sit upon the throne, because it's not the throne, but who sits in it. And just like he said to Thor before he died, despite everything he's done, what will he do now? It's his choice. He's not predetermined to fall back into his old ways. He can choose to be better. That's what Valhalla shows him, and he walks out, finally emerging into the champion he was fated to become so long ago. For closing, All of this is great, and I'm pretty glad for the lack of Atreus. He's barely even mentioned outside the notebook. I'm happy with this because if we do get an Atreus DLC, I'll actually be ready for it because I'm completely satisfied with Kratos' story. Overall, this is a 10 out of 10 DLC, 100%. I think even if you had to pay for it, it'd be this good, but because you don't is what sets it above the others. It truly is a love letter to fans, to Kratos' character, and to the Norse saga in total. As for what it's missing, I kinda wanted to have a boss fight with young Kratos. I know that's a bit absurd, and it wouldn't even make sense for the narrative, and it's subjective, and I shouldn't base the entire video on it, but still, I wish we could have had it. I wanted it. I know it's unreasonable, but I did. Also, last part of the video, I really liked the music across the entire DLC. From the subtle Valkyrie themes on the shore to the epic tier boss music. I don't know where Barry McCreary just pulled that out of nowhere, but I really appreciate the effort. Anyway, if you enjoyed, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss another one. Or not, that's fine. Play nice, people.